Catherine of Aragon, born 1485 in Spain, the first wife of England's King Henry VIII, and the daughter of Spanish monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Her marriage to Henry was initially a political alliance, and she served as queen from their marriage in 1509 until their controversial divorce in 1533. Her inability to produce a male heir led Henry to seek an annulment, setting off a chain of events that ultimately led to England's break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. Despite the personal and political turmoil, Catherine remained widely respected for her dignity and faith throughout the ordeal. Her steadfast commitment to her marriage and her Catholic faith significantly impacted English and the wider European history, influencing religious policy and politics across the continent. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, it's great to have you with me again. As always, if you want to support the channel, you're already doing it, simply by enjoying the videos. If you want to go above and beyond, a like and subscribe, and having a look in the description if you feel so inclined to, certainly goes a long way. Now, without further ado, let us begin. Get nice and relaxed. Our full biography of Catherine of Aragon. December 16th, 1485. Catherine was born at the Archbishop's Palace of Alcalá de Henares, near Madrid in modern-day Spain. As the youngest surviving child of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile, she was introduced to a realm influenced profoundly by her illustrious lineage. Her appearance was marked by her long red hair, wide blue eyes and a fair complexion, completed by a round face and stature on the shorter side, reflected in the artwork of the time. Her roots traced back to the English royal house of Lancaster through her maternal line. Her great-grandmother and namesake, Catherine of Lancaster, alongside her great-grandmother, Philippa of Lancaster, both daughters of John the Gaunt and granddaughters of Edward III of England. This connection rendered her not only the third cousin of Henry VII of England, but also the fourth cousin of Elizabeth of York, linking her fatefully to the English crown. Her education in her formative years was, of course, robust and diverse, overseen by one Alessandro Gheraldini, a learned clerk of the Holy Order. Her studies spanned the normal: arithmetic, both canon and civil law, classical literature, genealogy, heraldry, history, philosophy, religion, of course, fostering a profound Roman Catholic faith that would significantly shape her later endeavors. And it wasn't just those subjects. She was also fluent in Castilian, Spanish, and Latin, also with competencies in French and Greek. Her intellectual pursuits were heavily praised by Erasmus, who noted her lifelong dedication to good literature. Beyond the scholarly, Catherine's training extended to the domestic and artistic realms. She reportedly mastered cooking, embroidery, lace-making, sewing, spinning, and weaving, and she was also proficient in music, dancing and drawing from an early age. This comprehensive education not only prepared her for the rigors of court life, but also imbued her with the etiquette that was necessary to navigate these complexities of her future roles in the English monarchy. So, from this very young age, she was earmarked as an ideal consort for Arthur, the Prince of Wales, and also the prospective English king. Her eligibility was significantly enhanced by her maternal English ancestry. Catherine's claim to the English throne was theoretically stronger than that of Henry VII, derived as it was from John of Gaunt, the first Duke of Lancaster's marriages to Blanche of Lancaster and Constance of Castile. Henry VIII, on the other hand, descended from Gaunt's third union with Catherine Swynford, whose offspring were initially illegitimate and only later legitimized, yet still barred from succession. This tenuous claim of Henry's casts shadows on the Tudor legitimacy, with some European realms remaining skeptical of the new dynasty. In stark contrast stood the prestigious House of Trastamara, led by Catherine's parents, the Catholic monarchs whose renown made them Europe's foremost royal family. The union between Catherine and Arthur was thus seen not merely as a matrimonial alliance, but as a vital endorsement of the Tudor claim to the English throne, offering any potential male offspring a robust claim of his own. The marital arrangements thus advanced swiftly, with the couple being married by proxy on the 19th of May 1499, and engaging in correspondence in Latin until deemed mature enough for cohabitation. When the time came for Catherine to journey to England, her entourage was a testament to her status. She was accompanied by illustrious figures such as Diego Fernandez de Cordoba, the third Count of Cabra, Alonso de Fonseca, the Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, and Antonio de Royas Manrique, the Bishop of Mallorca. Notably, her retinue included the first Africans recorded in London, among them the trumpeter John Blank, a symbol of exotic luxury that highlighted the power and reach of her family. Initially expected at Gravesend, Catherine's arrival was met with a retinue of English gentlewomen in October of 1501, ready to escort her via a flotilla of barges up the Thames to the Tower of London, a majestic procession that showed the significance of her arrival, and also the hopes that were pinned upon this union. August 17th, 1501, the youthful Catherine, of just 15 years old, embarked on her journey from A Coruña, destined to meet her future husband, Arthur, the Prince of Wales. Their first encounter occurred on the 4th of November at Dogmersfield in Hampshire. Despite their prior exchanges, through letters written in Latin, their initial face-to-face meeting revealed a surprising barrier. Differing pronunciations of Latin rendered their spoken conversations almost unintelligible to one another. Nevertheless, Arthur expressed his joy and commitment in letters to his parents and in-laws, affirming his intent to be and I quote, true and loving husband, and of course his delight at finally seeing his lovely bride. The young couple's marriage was solemnized just 10 days later, on the 14th of November, 1501, at Old St. Paul's Cathedral, with both bride and groom still only 15 years old. A substantial dowry of 200,000 ducats underscored the union, half of which was promptly paid following the ceremony. On this notable occasion, Catherine and her Spanish ladies-in-waiting made a distinct impression, arrayed in the traditional styles of their homeland, adding a little bit of color to that bleak countryside up north. Well, post-marriage, Arthur had his own responsibilities. He was dispatched to preside over the Council of Wales and the marches from Ludlow Castle, a responsibility befitting his status as Prince of Wales. Catherine accompanied him, embracing her own new role. However, their life together was abruptly challenged when both were struck by illness, possibly the dreaded sweating sickness prevalent at the time. Tragically, poor old Arthur had succumbed to the disease on the 2nd of April 1502, leaving Catherine, now just 16 years old, a widow, far from her native Spain, navigating her uncertain future all alone. Following the premature demise of Arthur, Henry VII was confronted with a significant fiscal and diplomatic dilemma regarding that 200,000 ducat dowry of his daughter-in-law Catherine. As stipulated in her marriage contract, should Catherine return to her native Spain, the substantial dowry, of which we have mentioned only half had been paid, would need to be completely refunded to her father. This predicament was further complicated by the death of Queen Elizabeth in February of 1503, which prompted King Henry VII to contemplate marrying Catherine himself. However, opposition, understandably from Catherine's father, and concerns about the legitimacy of any offspring from such a union quickly quashed this prospect. In an attempt to resolve the situation and retain the dowry within England, they came up with a new arrangement. Catherine would marry Henry VII's second son, the younger Henry, the Duke of York. However, the death of Catherine's mother, which shifted the inheritance of the larger kingdom of Castile to her elder sister Joanna, diminished Catherine's allure in the dynastic marriage market. Well, despite the agreement, the marriage was repeatedly delayed, ostensibly until the young Henry was of suitable age, though the real impediment was Ferdinand II's reluctance to pay the remainder of the dowry, casting doubt on whether the marriage would ever transpire. Well, during this period of uncertainty, Catherine lived under constrained circumstances at Durham House in London, where she was treated more like a detainee than a princess. Her financial struggles were exacerbated by the responsibility of providing for her ladies-in-waiting as well as herself, and that's some pretty high maintenance costs. While the surviving correspondence with her father reveals her resilience and pragmatism, as she once confided to him, and I quote, "I choose what I believe and say nothing, for I am not as simple as I may seem." Well, in 1507, Catherine's situation took quite a remarkable turn when she was appointed as the Spanish ambassador to England, marking her as the first woman to hold such a position in European history. Contrary to Henry VII's expectations of her being somewhat malleable, Catherine demonstrated considerable diplomatic acumen, standing on her own 2 feet, not to be pushed around by the boys, defying the anticipations of the English court. The proposed marriage to Henry, the Duke of York, hinged on a dispensation from the Pope, as canon law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. Catherine steadfastly maintained that her marriage to Arthur had never actually been consummated, thereby aligning with canon law that a non-consummated marriage could be dissolved, thus paving the way for her eventual marriage to the future King Henry VIII of England. Thus, on the 11th of June, 1509, 7 years following the death of Prince Arthur, Catherine of Aragon once again stood at the altar, this time joined in new matrimony to the newly ascended Henry VIII in a private ceremony held at the church of the observant friars just outside Greenwich Palace. At 23 years old now, Catherine embarked on this second significant chapter of her royal journey, marrying a king who had only recently claimed the throne. Thus, the coronation of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a splendid and pivotal event, took place shortly thereafter. On the eve of their coronation, Saturday the 23rd of June, they participated in the traditional procession to Westminster Abbey, which drew a large and enthusiastic crowd. Following custom, the couple spent the night at the Tower of London, the most romantic spot in the city, preparing for the grandeur to follow. The next day, Midsummer's Day, they were anointed and crowned together in a majestic ceremony at Westminster Abbey, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The coronation was of course a grand affair, complete with a celebratory banquet held in Westminster Hall, and the creation of many new Knights of the Bath in honor of the event. In the weeks that followed, a series of social occasions introduced the new queen to her subjects. Catherine, with her dignified presence and grace, made a strong and favorable impression on the English populace, who received her warmly. Her ascension to Queen Consort marked the beginning of a new era and set the stage for her influential role in the Tudor court. June the 11th, 1513, as Henry VIII embarked on a military campaign to France, Catherine of Aragon was appointed as Regent of England, bearing the formidable title Governor of the Realm and Captain General. Her regency was immediately tested by the capture of Louis d'Orléans, Duke of Longueville and Thorouanne, although Henry sent Duke to Catherine's household. She, concerned about security due to the active Scottish threat to the north, expressed to her Cardinal Wolsey a preference for the Duke's confinement in the Tower of London. In her correspondence, she fervently prayed for divine favour, similar to that which the English king had enjoyed in France. The ongoing war with Scotland, of course, demanded her full attention. Catherine was industrious at Richmond Palace, personally overseeing the production of standards, banners, and badges essential for the war effort. She rallied support by writing to towns such as Gloucester for muster lists, urging the assembly of troops capable of defending the realm. The Scots invasion propelled her to order Thomas Lovell to muster forces from the Midland counties on the 3rd of September, 1513. By the 8th of September, some 5 days later, Catherine, despite her advanced pregnancy, donned full armor and rode north to inspire her troops with a stirring address. Her eloquence and resolve were so impactful that reports of her speech reached Peter Martyr de Anguera in Valladolid within weeks. Contrary to reports that placed her 100 miles north of London when the victory at the Battle of Flodden Field was announced, she was actually near Buckingham. From Woburn Abbey she sent Henry a piece of the bloodied coat of the fallen King James IV of Scotland, suggesting it to be used as a banner at the siege of Tournai. Remarkable taste, as always. Well, as she aged, Catherine's commitment to her Catholic faith deepened, paralleled by a growing interest in academia. She actively educated her daughter when she came along, Mary, and influenced the broader trend of female education, donating generously to several colleges. Meanwhile, Henry had some concerns, and they were concerns about securing a male heir. Well, reminded, of course, by the historical precedents of long civil wars that were triggered by female succession. So it wasn't just Henry who was crossing his fingers for this. It was everybody else, because they could see what was going to happen a mile away if there was a struggle for power in the wake of Henry's death. It never ends peacefully. Well, in 1520, politics shifted once more, with a visit from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Catherine had advocated for an English alliance with Charles over France. Following his departure, she joined Henry in a magnificent visit to France for the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Yet, within 2 years, England had declared war on France, and Charles V was welcomed back, this time with plans to betroth him to Mary. By 1525, Henry's affections had shifted dramatically towards one Anne Boleyn, a young lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, who was, by the way, significantly younger than the king, between 10 and 17 years his junior. As Catherine was no longer able to conceive, Henry's frustrations and desires for a male heir intensified. He began to question the legitimacy of his marriage to Catherine, driven mainly by a biblical interpretation suggesting a union with a brother's widow would be childless. Well, although Catherine maintained until her death that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, making her a virgin at the time she married Henry, Henry still saw their marriage as divinely cursed. Well, that's one way of getting out of it. The question of whether the Pope had the authority to override what Henry had viewed as a scriptural impediment became central in his fervent campaign to obtain this annulment. And it's highly likely that the push for an annulment was influenced early on by Henry's desperation for a son, considering the historical context of civil wars fought over the English crown before his father's reign. Bad memories. They don't want to go through that again. Well, his resolve to secure an annulment became his overriding mission. Catherine, however, dug her heels in and remained resolute, famously refusing the suggestion to retire to a nunnery with the assertion, I quote, "God never called me to a nunnery. I am the king's true and legitimate wife." Hard to argue with that, isn't it? Well, in pursuit of his goal, Henry circumvented Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, initially keeping him in the dark, and dispatched his secretary William Knight to Pope Clement VII to argue that the dispensation by Pope Julius II was actually obtained under false pretenses. However, the task proved daunting, as Pope Clement VII was then a captive of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, following a rather unfortunate sacking of Rome in the May of 1527. Now, Knight's mission was stymied, by the way, leading Henry to reluctantly involve Wolsey, who strove to secure a favourable decision the best way he could. And amidst all of these ecclesiastical negotiations, both Pope Clement VII and the reformer Martin Luther, who was universally loved and popular at the time, suggested an unconventional solution: that Henry might take 2 wives to maintain the royal dignities of both Catherine and their daughter Mary. This proposal was not aimed at reintroducing polygamy broadly, but rather as a specific measure to resolve the royal dilemma. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey took significant steps to resolve Henry's dilemma by setting up an ecclesiastical court in England, with a papal representative presiding, on both Henry and Catherine in attendance. Despite this effort, the Pope, possibly swayed by the influence of Charles V, Catherine's nephew, recalled his legatee, thereby halting any proceedings taking place in England. Henry perceived the Pope's actions as a clear signal that an annulment of his marriage to the Emperor's aunt was not going to happen. Consequently, the Pope explicitly forbade Henry from remarrying until a decision was reached, and he meant a decision in Rome. Wolsey's failure in this endeavour led to his dismissal from public office in 1529. Subsequently, he engaged in a covert attempt to have Anne Boleyn exiled and communicated with the Pope towards this end. Upon discovery, Henry was not impressed and ordered the immediate arrest of Wolsey. His death in 1530 from terminal illness likely spared him from execution for treason. Which leads us to 1531, the following year after all of these tumultuous events, if we may say so. Catherine was removed from court, and her chambers were reassigned to Anne Boleyn, can imagine how she felt. As a matter of fact, you don't need to imagine. We have a letter that she had wrote to Charles V expressing her despair at the time, and I'll quickly read a passage from said letter. My tribulations are so great, my life so disturbed by the plans daily invented to further the king's wicked intention, the surprises which the king gives me, with certain persons of his council are so mortal, and my treatment is what God knows, that is enough to shorten 10 lives, much more my own. Obviously not very impressed with the goings-on in the court. Well, in terms of religious affairs, the ecclesiastical landscape shifted further when Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham passed away, and Thomas Cranmer, the Boleyn's family chaplain, was appointed to the position. As Henry pushed for an annulment, John Fisher emerged as Catherine's staunch advocate, boldly defending the sanctity of her marriage in the papal court. His outspoken stance, reminiscent of John the Baptist's readiness to sacrifice himself for his belief, certainly drew Henry's ire. More than a raised eyebrow, perhaps a clenched fist. It prompted the king to craft a detailed Latin rebuttal to Fisher's arguments. Fisher's annotated copy of Henry's address, by the way, still exists, evidencing his fearless disposition despite the king's wrath. You've got to be pretty brave to go up against the King of England. Well, following the transfer of the case to Rome, Fisher's direct involvement ended, but Henry's resentment towards him persisted. Catherine's plight garnered widespread support, not only from Fisher but also from notable figures such as Thomas More, Henry's sister Mary Tudor, the Queen of France, Maria de Salinas, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Pope Paul III, and even Martin Luther himself, illustrating the broad and diverse backing she received during her ordeal. Well, after a covert meeting in Calais with King Francis I of France, Henry returned to Dover and, in secret, married Anne Boleyn. The precise motives behind their hasty marriage are debated. Some believe that Anne was already pregnant, and Henry wished to avoid the possibility of an illegitimate heir, while others argue that Anne, having witnessed her sister Mary Boleyn's brief affair with the king and subsequent disregard, insisted on a marriage before any intimate relations. Smart girl. Henry justified their union by arguing the invalidity of his marriage to Catherine, given her prior marriage to his brother Arthur, and he thus claimed that if Catherine's marriage to Arthur was consummated, he was free to marry under canon law. At least that's what he kept repeating to himself and the angry onlookers as he tied the knot with his new wife. Well, on May 23rd, 1533, Thomas Cranmer, presiding over a specially convened court at Dunstable Priory, officially declared Henry's marriage to Catherine unlawful, dismissing Catherine's steadfast assertion that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. And just 5 days later, Cranmer affirmed the legality of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. So, it was done. The paperwork had all been signed, and, well, it was all over for Catherine. Well, not quite. Despite these declarations, Catherine maintained her status as Henry's legitimate wife and England's rightful queen till her dying day, a title her servants continued to use in her presence. However, Henry only recognized her as the, quote, Dowager Princess of Wales. Still not a bad title, but not the one she wanted. He acknowledged her as the widow of his brother, rather than as a queen. Well, her final years were marked by isolation and frequent relocations. She resided at the Moor Castle in Hertfordshire, starting in late 1531, going back in time there for a moment, before being moved to the royal palace of Hatfield, Elsing Palace in Enfield, Ampthill Castle in Bedfordshire, and finally the coveted Buckden Towers in Cambridgeshire. Just a side note, don't you just love these English town names? They're just so charming. Well, in July of 1533, she was moved to Kimbolton Castle, where she lived a reclusive life, dressed in the austere garb of a Order of St. Francis, and adhering to strict religious fasts. Catherine reportedly rarely left her room, except of course to attend Mass. Although she was allowed occasional visitors, she and her daughter Mary were prohibited from seeing or even writing to each other. However, sympathetic intermediaries secretly exchanged letters between them. Henry proposed improving living conditions and the possibility of reunion if both of them had acknowledged Anne Boleyn as queen. But good luck getting that to happen. Both mother and daughter steadfastly refused. In the late December of 1535, with her health rapidly deteriorating, Catherine prepared for her impending death. She drafted her will and reached out to her nephew, Emperor Charles V, requesting his protection for her daughter Mary. Amidst these solemn preparations, she is said to have written a poignant final letter to King Henry VIII, and it goes a little like this, and it's a little bit sad, forewarning. My most dear Lord, King, and husband, the hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me, my case being such, to commend myself to you, and to put you in remembrance with a few words of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and pampering of the body, for which you have cast me into many calamities and yourself into many troubles. For my part, I pardon you everything, and I wish to devoutly pray God that He will pardon you also. For the rest, I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I have heretofore desired. I entreat you also, on behalf of my maids, to give them marriage portions, which is not much, they being but 3. For all my other servants, I solicit the wages due them, and a year more, lest they be unprovided for. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things. From Catherine, the Queen. I told you it was sad. While the authenticity of the letter has been debated, its contents certainly reflect the enduring grace and even forgiveness that Catherine maintained towards Henry. Well, we can say for sure that if this letter was somehow intercepted by Henry's new wife, well, that would certainly cause an argument. Some things never change. Thus Catherine passed away on the 7th of January 1536 at Kimbolton Castle. The news of her death spurred various reactions at court, and of course sparked rumors of foul play, including speculation that she had been poisoned, possibly by Gregory de Cassal. Mourning practices also attracted attention. Anne Boleyn and possibly Henry himself were reported to have worn yellow, a color associated with mourning in Spain, though this was seen by some as inappropriate or perhaps even celebratory. Despite the public display, both Henry and Anne reportedly mourned privately later that day. On the day of her funeral, Anne miscarried a male child, leading to further grim rumors about Catherine's death, though modern experts believe that her symptoms, as reported, were more consistent with those of cancer. Either way, she was laid to rest in Peterborough Castle, honoured as a Dowager Princess of Wales, but of course not as the Queen. Henry abstained from the funeral, and also prohibited their daughter Mary from attending, highlighting the continued complexities of his relationships and the turbulent era of his reign. Regardless, not a very kind move to bar Mary from going to her own mother's funeral under any circumstance. Now let's talk just a little bit about Catherine's religious observance, because it is a rather important part of her life. So before we go, let's just say a few words on that. Of course, she was deeply committed to her faith, and a devout member of the Third Order of St. Francis. She meticulously balanced these royal duties of hers, in any capacity, with her religious obligations, seamlessly integrating the demands of her role as queen and later on the smaller role she played, with her personal piety. Now, after her marriage to Henry was annulled, she famously declared her spiritual priorities by stating, and these are her words, "I would rather be a poor beggar's wife and be sure of heaven, than queen of all the world and stand in doubt thereof by reason of my own consent." Thus, her religious practice was marked by a focus on the essential elements of Catholic devotion, the Big Four: Mass, prayer, confession, and penance, rather than the outward celebration of saints and holy relics, which she did not emphasize in her personal views on spirituality. But despite this, she remained acutely aware of the flaws she perceived within the Church's hierarchy, though she maintained a critical distance from the more radical criticisms like those proposed by Martin Luther of 1517, which ignited the Protestant Reformation, and, well, plenty of other events. You may want to watch the video on Martin Luther. It's quite interesting, especially his later writings. Now that is a rabbit hole. Well, back to Catherine. In her youth, she was lauded for her exceptional beauty, described as, and I quote, "the most beautiful creature in the world," and it was said that there was nothing lacking in her that the most beautiful girl should have. Esteemed figures like Thomas More and Lord Herbert later reflected on her appearance, noting, there were few women who could compete with the Queen in her prime. These accolades highlight the remarkable impression Catherine made with her striking looks and royal demeanor throughout her life. But of course, it's not all about the outside appearance. It can't be. She was not only a queen, but also a pioneering advocate for women's education, and that is important. This is exemplified by the controversial book, at least at the time, The Education of a Christian Woman by Juan Luis Vives, which argued that women have the right to an education, and was both dedicated to and commissioned by Catherine. I know this all sounds pretty obvious, but you must send your brain back in time a little bit. Well, her influence extended even to her adversaries, as Thomas Cromwell, a known opponent, remarked, if not for her being a woman, she could have defied all the heroes of history. Catherine's compassion was evident when she successfully interceded on the behalf of the rebels of the evil May Day, advocating for their lives for the sake of their families, not often something you see in royals. Her commitment to social welfare in general was further demonstrated through her initiation of an extensive program for the relief of the poor. A patron of Renaissance humanism, Catherine was friends with notable scholars such as Erasmus and Thomas More, and some even viewed her as a kind of martyr. Well, her final resting place in Peterborough Cathedral is a site of continuous tribute. You'll rarely see it without decorations of flowers or pomegranates, which are, by the way, her heraldic symbol. Hers is a tomb that proudly bears the inscription, Catherine, Queen of England. In the 20th century, George V's wife, Mary of Teck, had her grave notably enhanced, further infirming her as her status as queen. Annually, Peterborough Cathedral holds a service in her memory, featuring processions, prayers, and various events, including tributes at her grave with candles, pomegranates, flowers, and other offerings. Notably, the Spanish ambassador to the United Kingdom attended the service commemorating the 470th anniversary of her death. And in 2010, the service included a reading of Catherine's speech before the Legatine Court by actress Jane Lapotaire. In her birthplace of Alcalá de Henares, a statue captured her as a young woman holding a book and a rose, symbolizing her lifelong dedication to not only learning, but everlasting grace. And if you've listened this far, perhaps you too have a dedication to learning. Not many make it to this point. If you did, you get the special message. Anne Boleyn, born around 1501, the second wife of King Henry VIII of England, and a crucial figure in the political and religious upheaval that led to the English Reformation. Well educated in the Netherlands and France, Anne was well prepared for the complexities of the English court, which she navigated with her own ambition and acumen. Her refusal to become Henry VIII's mistress set in motion a chain of events that resulted in England's break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England, with Henry seeking to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to wed Anne. Their marriage in 1533 heralded significant religious changes, but it was all short-lived, as Anne was unable to provide a male heir, leading to her arrest on fabricated charges, including adultery and treason. Thus she was executed in 1536, leaving behind a daughter, however, Elizabeth I, who would of course become one of England's most celebrated monarchs. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it is your first time here, very happy to meet you indeed, and if you're coming back, off we go again on another adventure into the past. If you'd like to support the channel, you're doing a very good job as it is. Just enjoy the content at your own pace. But a like and subscribe certainly helps, and if you want to go above and beyond, there's a few links in the description. But now, let's all get nice and relaxed, and we may begin. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, was born to one Thomas Boleyn, later Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond, and Elizabeth Howard, the eldest daughter of Thomas Howard, the future second Duke of Norfolk. The exact date of Anne's birth remains uncertain, with scholarly debate primarily centered around 2 years, circa 1501 and circa 1507. Anne's familial background included her older sister, Mary, and a younger brother by the name of George, born around 1504. This birth order is supported by claims from Mary's descendants, notably her grandson, who successfully claimed the Ormond title in 1496, asserting his grandmother's status as the elder daughter, a claim recognized by Queen Elizabeth I. During her formative years, her education was typical of a woman of her status, focusing not only on academics like arithmetic, grammar, and history, but also on essential domestic skills like embroidery and household management. Throw in a little bit of music, and we can see a very diverse range of skills. Additionally, she was trained in more physical pursuits, such as archery, horseback riding, falconry, and hunting. Now, these formative years were significantly shaped by her time spent in influential European courts, due to her father, Thomas Boleyn's diplomatic career under Henry VIII. His charm and effectiveness as a diplomat garnered admiration from key figures, such as Margaret of Austria, the daughter of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who at the time was ruling the Netherlands on behalf of her nephew Charles. Margaret was so impressed with Boleyn that she offered Anne a coveted position in her household, and this was a rare honor, typically reserved for girls aged 12, suggesting Anne might have been younger when she began her court life, as indicated by Margaret affectionately calling her the little Boleyn. Anne's stay in the Netherlands at the court of Savoy in Mechelen, beginning in spring 1513, was also an important aspect of her upbringing. She was well regarded by Margaret, who praised her demeanor and intelligence. In October 1514, Anne moved to France to serve as a maid of honor, first to Queen Mary, Henry VIII's sister, upon her marriage to Louis XII of France, and subsequently to Mary's stepdaughter, Queen Claude. Thus she remained in the French court for nearly 7 years, a period during which she refined her French language skills and developed a keen interest in the arts and humanities, including fashion, illuminated manuscripts, literature, music, and of course religious philosophy. And it was here in France where Anne's evangelical leanings likely took root, influenced by reformist books, and Jacques Lefebvre's French translations of the Bible and Pauline epistles. Her exposure to French culture, its etiquette, its dance, and its literature, alongside her experience in flirtation and courtly love, equipped her with a sophisticated persona that resonated quite strongly back at the English court. A continental flair, let's put it that way. Anne's acquaintance with Margaret de Navarre, King Francis I's sister, and a noted author and reformer, further nurtured her religious and literary inclinations. Thus, her return to England marked a transfer of continental influence into the English court, where her keen fashion sense, cultural knowledge, and religious ideas had a great influence on many. Her time in France not only polished her personal qualities, but also positioned her as an agent of religious and cultural reform, guiding, albeit very subtly, the English monarchy towards a historic break with the Catholic Church. Thus, those early years back in England were marked by a good dose of political and familial machinations that significantly influenced her trajectory. One of the pivotal moments was when she was recalled from the Netherlands to potentially marry her Irish cousin, James Butler. The marriage proposal was not born out of romantic considerations, but was rather a strategic move intended to resolve a dispute over the earldom of Ormond. The 7th Earl of Ormond had died in 1515, leaving his inheritance in question, with Sir Piers Butler contesting the will against the claims of Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, who was descended from the eldest daughters of the previous Earl. King Henry VIII, concerned about the potential for civil unrest in Ireland over this dispute, supported a plan to marry Anne off to James Butler. This union was intended to consolidate the claims and pacify any conflict by bringing the Ormond inheritance as Anne's dowry. However, negotiations failed, and it was possibly due to Sir Thomas Boleyn's ambitions for a more advantageous match for Anne, or perhaps even so, his own aspirations to the titles. James Butler went on to marry Lady Joan Fitzgerald, who was another prominent heir. But Anne Boleyn would always be the one who got away from him. Now, parallel to Anne's failed marriage negotiations, her sister Mary Boleyn was recalled from France in 1519, where she had been involved with members of the French court, including the king. Soon after returning, Mary married one William Carey, a courtier, in a ceremony attended by Henry VIII. Despite her marriage, Mary became the mistress of Henry VIII, although the paternity of her children during this time remains a topic of historical debate. While some historians speculate that Henry VIII may have been the father of one or both of Mary's children, he never acknowledged them as he did with his recognized illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, by Elizabeth Blount. By 1522, Anne had herself secured a position at the English court as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. She made her public debut at a court pageant in March of 1522, where she played Perseverance, and immediately impressed the court with her elegance and intellect. This marked the beginning of her rise as one of the most prominent and influential figures at the court. Thus Anne's presence and demeanor quickly attracted the attention of several suitors. Her charm and sophistication made her a standout figure at the English court. Described by historians as the perfect woman courtier, her grace, style, and accomplishments in dance, music, and languages captivated those around her. Partnered with this, her vibrant energy and engaging personality not only drew people into conversation, but it kept them entertained, making her a focal point of any social gathering, the life of the party. Well, during her time here at the court, Anne had become romantically involved with Henry Percy, the son of the Earl of Northumberland. The two entered into a secret betrothal, a relationship that, according to George Cavendish, did not become consummated. However, this engagement was ended abruptly due to a lack of support from Percy's father and opposition from Thomas Wolsey, for reasons that still to this day remain a little speculative. Either way, following the end of this relationship, Anne was temporarily sent away from court to her family's estates in the countryside, although details about this period are sparse. Upon her return to court, she re-entered the service of Catherine of Aragon. Meanwhile, Henry Percy was married to Lady Mary Talbot, an arrangement made since his adolescence. Around this time, Anne also befriended Sir Thomas Wyatt, a prominent poet of the Tudor era, whose marital troubles coincided with a growing affection for Anne, although their relationship is believed to have remained platonic. Anne's most significant and history-altering courtship began in 1526, when King Henry VIII, a seasoned player of courtly love, became completely infatuated with her. Anne skillfully navigated the king's advances, refusing to become just another mistress, and often retreating to Hever Castle for periods of seclusion. Her resistance only fueled the king's desire, leading to his proposal of marriage within a year of his pursuit. Both Henry and Anne believed that an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon would be swift, although it ultimately took several years, profoundly altering the religious landscape of England. Throughout their long courtship, which spanned approximately 7 years, there is no substantial evidence to suggest that Henry and Anne's relationship was consummated, until at least shortly before their marriage. The surviving love letters from Henry to Anne during this period reflect a deep affection and desire, but also a kind of respect for Anne's stance on maintaining their relationship chaste, until marriage at least. Henry VIII's desire for a male heir was a significant driving force behind his quest for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. The Tudor period, you see, was marked by a deep concern for a secure succession, a legacy of the civil wars over royal succession that had plagued England before Henry VIII established relative stability was still looming over everyone. Now Henry VIII was acutely aware of this history, and he sought to prevent any uncertainty regarding the legitimacy of his heir. Thus, his marriage to Catherine had failed to produce a surviving male child, with only their daughter, Mary, surviving infancy. Catherine had initially come to England to marry Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died shortly after their marriage. When Spain and England sought to maintain their alliance, Pope Julius II granted a dispensation for Henry and Catherine's marriage, under the condition that Catherine claimed to still be a virgin after Arthur's death. Over time, Henry grew increasingly concerned about the validity of his marriage, particularly as Catherine could not produce a male heir, which he took as a sign of divine displeasure. But along comes Anne Boleyn, and complicates the whole situation even more. Her refusal to become his mistress, insisting instead on marriage, catalyzed Henry's challenge to the Catholic Church's authority over his marriage decisions. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid according to biblical scripture, claiming that the Pope had no authority to legitimize what he saw as essentially incestuous and sinful. This theological and legal battle over his marriage to Catherine came to be known as the King's Great Matter. Anne leveraged Henry's infatuation with her and his desperation for a legitimate male heir to position herself not only as his potential wife, but as a significant political partner. She refused to consummate their relationship until she was queen, a stance that ultimately played a role in Henry's decision to break from the Church and establish the Church of England. And when he did, his authority was recognized as supreme in all religious matters. Of course, the Catholic Church were not too happy with it, but, Now historians debate Anne's motives and her commitment to religious reform. Some view her as a devout evangelical, eager for religious reform, and playing a significant role in influencing Henry's religious policies, but others suggest her religious beliefs were a little more conventional, and that her actions were driven more by personal ambition than by deep-seated theological convictions. There is evidence suggesting Anne's sympathy towards Reformation efforts, including anecdotes of her promoting religious texts that critique the Catholic Church's excesses, such as Tyndale's writings or Simon Fisher's work, A Supplication for the Beggars. And she also supported scholars working on English translations of the Bible, and sought to instill scriptural piety in her ladies-in-waiting. Well, in 1528, a severe outbreak of sweating sickness struck London, leading to high mortality rates and causing the royal court to disperse. Henry VIII left London, frequently moving to escape the illness, while Anne Boleyn retreated to Hever Castle, the Boleyn family residence. It was there that Anne contracted the disease, and her brother-in-law, William Carey, succumbed to it. In his concern for Anne's health, Henry sent his personal physician to care for her, and she eventually recovered. As Anne recuperated, Henry intensified his efforts to secure an annulment from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He initiated a direct appeal to the Holy See, bypassing Cardinal Wolsey initially, who had been his chief advisor on the matter. Henry's envoy, William Knight, was dispatched to Pope Clement VII with the mission to annul the marriage on grounds that the original dispensation by Pope Julius II had actually been obtained under false pretenses. Additionally, Henry sought permission to remarry, specifically making provisions that would allow him to marry Anne, indicating the influence she had gained over him. However, this task proved to be a challenging one, as Pope Clement was effectively a prisoner of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, following the sack of Rome in 1527. Knight faced difficulties in gaining access to the Pope, and eventually returned with only a conditional dispensation, which Wolsey deemed to be insufficient. Consequently, Henry had very little choice, and he entrusted Wolsey with the annulment process. Wolsey convened an ecclesiastical court in England with the Pope's emissary, Lorenzo Campeggio, but no decisive action was taken, as Campeggio had no papal authorization to make a ruling. Wolsey's inability to secure the annulment strained his relationship with Henry and Anne, who suspected his loyalties lay more with the Pope than with the English crown. Anne's influence and Wolsey's other detractors led to his dismissal and eventual arrest on charges of praemunire, which is acting in the interest of a foreign ruler over your own king. Treason, basically. But Wolsey died of illness in 1530, before any trial could take place. Possibly what they had planned for him if he was found guilty, which he would have been. Well, perhaps that would have been worse than dying from illness. Now, by 1531, Catherine of Aragon was banished from the court, and her living quarters were reassigned to Anne, another sign of her rising status. However, the public were not too pleased with this. Their support largely remained with Catherine. In one incident in 1531, Anne narrowly escaped an angry mob by the Thames, showing once again the public discontent with her role in the king's marital strife, seen at this time by a great many, especially in London, as a home-wrecker. Well, the death of Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham in 1532 led to the appointment of the Boleyn family chaplain, Thomas Cranmer, as his successor, marking a significant shift towards a reformist influence within the church. And that same year, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, pushed through critical legislative acts that recognized royal supremacy over the church, cementing the break with Rome and setting the stage for the establishment of the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. Well, even before her marriage to Henry VIII, Anne wielded significant influence at the English court. She had the authority to grant petitions, receive diplomats, and provide patronage, reflecting a substantial influence over Henry, even to the extent of advocating on behalf of foreign diplomats. Well, this period marked her as an increasingly central figure in England's political and international affairs. Thus, her influence was particularly evident in strengthening England's international position, notably by fostering an alliance with France. She developed a strong rapport with the French ambassador, Gilles de la Pommeraye, which facilitated diplomatic relations. In a strategic move to solidify her status both within England and on the international stage, Henry VIII conferred upon Anne the Marquisate of Pembroke on the 1st of September 1532. This title was not only a mark of her impending queenship, but also as a necessary status symbol in preparation for their meeting with King Francis I of France in Calais later that year. The investiture, performed by Henry himself, with de la Pommeraye as a guest of honor, showed once again her elevated position. The conference at Calais was a political success, securing implicit support from the French government for Henry's plans to remarry, despite King Francis I's delicate balancing act due to his alliances with the Pope. And of course, Anne's ascent to power also brought considerable benefits to her family. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was elevated to the title of Earl of Wiltshire, and arrangements were made for her Irish cousin to become the Earl of Ormond. During the celebrations of her father's elevation, Anne was given precedence over the Duchess of Suffolk and Norfolk, an honour that was typically reserved for the Queen. In addition to all the politics, Anne used her influence to secure financial support for her sister, Mary Boleyn, by arranging an annual pension. She also facilitated educational opportunities for her nephew, Henry VIII. Now, finally, Anne's marriage to Henry VIII was solidified through a ceremony in secret on November 14, 1532, followed by a public confirmation of their union in January of the following year, 1533. The legitimacy of their marriage was officially recognized by Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, in May of 1533. Cranmer's rulings, which declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void, subsequently validated Henry's marriage to Anne, and it marked the culmination of a complex series of events and loopholes, whether they be theological or political, that had finally led to this moment. Anne Boleyn's coronation of Queen Consort on June 1st, 1533, was thus a grand and meticulously orchestrated event that showed her new status and legitimacy of her forthcoming child. Crowned in Westminster Abbey, Anne was the last Queen Consort of England to have a separate coronation from her husband. Remarkably, she was crowned with St. Edward's crown, traditionally reserved for the coronation of a monarch, not a consort. This unusual choice, as suggested by historian Alice Hunt, was likely due to Anne's visible pregnancy and the expectation that she would bear a male heir. Well, the day before her coronation, Anne participated in a lavish procession through London, an event designed to showcase the new queen to the public. Seated in a magnificent litter made from white cloth of gold and adorned with a gold coronet, her appearance was intended to symbolize purity and royal dignity, though, as you can imagine, it received a mixed reception from the public. Simultaneously, significant political and religious shifts were underway. The House of Commons had enacted laws that rejected the authority of the Pope in England, culminating in Pope Clement VII's provisional excommunication of Henry VIII and Archbishop Cranmer. The Pope also declared Anne's marriage to Henry null and reaffirmed Catherine's status as queen. Despite this, Henry required his subjects to swear allegiance to the First Succession Act, which recognized Anne as the rightful queen, and with that, her offspring as legitimate heirs to the throne. The oath completely rejected papal authority, and notable figures who refused it, such as Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, were locked up, thrown in prison. It was non-negotiable. By late 1534, the English Parliament declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, and that effectively established a national church that was independent of Rome. Rome was, of course, not very happy about this. It was not merely a rejection of papal authority, but also a significant step towards the English Reformation, which is a very complicated topic that I will cover in another video. Wait for me, please. Now, throughout her tenure as queen, Anne Boleyn actively supported the Protestant Reformation. She was instrumental in promoting and protecting evangelicals and reformers, leveraging her influence to advance the translation and dissemination of the scriptures, notably those by William Tyndale. Anne's efforts also extended to personal interventions, as evidenced by her letter to Thomas Cromwell, wherein she sought assistance for Richard Herman, a merchant persecuted for his involvement in distributing the English New Testament. Anne's religious influence was also personal and long-lasting. She appointed Matthew Parker, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, as her chaplain, and entrusted him with the spiritual care of her daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, ensuring that her reformist legacy would endure beyond her lifetime. Also, if you're interested in Queen Elizabeth I, I have already done a video on her. It's in the Britain playlist, and I believe the Biographies playlist. Go and take a look. You'll enjoy it. Well, after her coronation, Anne Boleyn settled into life at Greenwich Palace, a favoured residence of King Henry VIII, as she prepared for the birth of her child. The anticipation was of course high for the birth of a son. Everyone was crossing their fingers, a male heir that Henry longed for to secure the Tudor lineage. However, I'm sure you can guess what happened. September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl, who was christened Elizabeth, possibly named in honour of her grandmother Elizabeth Howard and Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. The arrival of a daughter instead of a son came as let's just say, a disappointment to her parents, especially after the confident predictions of a male heir by court physicians and astrologers, who were, of course, always on the money with their predictions. Well, despite the initial disappointment, the infant Elizabeth was given a grand christening. After all, a daughter is as much of a blessing. Now, Anne, however, was conscious of the potential political threat posed by Henry's first daughter, Mary, who had been declared illegitimate and stripped of her princess title. To secure Elizabeth's position and alleviate Anne's concerns, Henry ordered that Mary be separated from her servants and sent to live at Hatfield House, where Elizabeth was also to reside under the care of her own substantial staff, in the healthy country air. It's not a bad deal. Now, Anne's role as queen was marked by a significant expansion in the size and scope of her household compared to her predecessor, Catherine. She maintained a large retinue of over 250 servants, and this ranged from priests to stable boys, and was attended by more than 60 maids of honor. Her court was a center of religious and political activity, and she engaged several priests as confessors and chaplains, including Matthew Parker, who later played a crucial role in establishing Anglican thought during Elizabeth's reign. But the early years of Anne's marriage to Henry were periods of relative happiness, interspersed with tension. Trouble was brewing in paradise, it seems. Let's have a look at some of the drama, shall we? Her intelligent and headstrong nature, which had been quite appealing when she was Henry's mistress, had now become a source of conflict now that she was queen and had actual power. In fact, there were reports of Anne speaking sharply even to her own family members, behavior that was deemed unseemly and, frankly, rude for the Queen. By Christmas of 1534, after a miscarriage or stillbirth, Henry was already discussing the possibility of simply throwing this marriage out the window. Although this did not immediately lead to action, and the couple did reconcile, at least for a time. Anne continued to preside over a lavish court, spending extensively on clothing, jewels, and renovations of numerous palaces to match the royal couple's extravagant tastes. Her personal motto was "the most happy," symbolized by her emblem of a white falcon. It was all about spending big, living in luxury, wherever you could get it in the old times of the 16th century. As a matter of fact, do remember, she grew up around those French courts. Now, it's not to say that French courts were better than English courts, but she wanted the best of both worlds. I'm talking continental imports, that sort of thing. Well, happy wife, happy life, as they say. Henry was sort of forced to oblige on that one. But despite her efforts to secure her position and contribute to the kingdom's religious reforms, public opinion of Anne deteriorated over time, particularly as no male heir was forthcoming. And her unpopularity was further compounded by her association with the political and religious executions of her opponents. That's one way to lose popularity. Figures such as Sir Thomas More and the Bishop John Fraser, and it led to her being harshly criticized, even referred to as the king's, well, you know that word that starts with W. It's a bad one. Well, the decline in public favor set the stage for her eventual downfall, as the enemies at court increased and her influence over Henry began to wane. It was around this time, January 7th, 1536, that Catherine of Aragon passed away, and it marked another pivotal moment for Anne and King Henry. Catherine's passing was met with visible relief from Henry, who wore yellow the following day, the color of joy and celebration in England. But, ironically, it's claimed it was one of mourning in Spain, but this is disputed. Now, this public display of festivity highlighted the complex and often strained relationships within the Tudor court. It was never really smooth sailing. No matter how rich and powerful you are, money never fixes family and marital disputes. You can never buy your way out of that one. Let that be a lesson to you if you think money's going to solve your problems, dear listener. While attempting to solidify her position and perhaps even soften her image, Anne made overtures towards reconciliation with Mary, Catherine's daughter, who steadfastly rejected these efforts. She wanted nothing to do with her. Rumors that Catherine had been poisoned, fueled by the discovery of a blackened heart during her embalming, only exacerbated tensions, despite medical consensus attributing the discoloration to cancer and not foul play. Well, during this period of chaos, Anne's personal and political stability began to waver significantly, and she was pregnant again. You know what that means. The stakes were high to produce a male heir. Simultaneously, Henry's attentions shifted towards a new woman, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's maids of honor. Seems that Henry already had one foot out the door, which is really not cool when your wife is pregnant. Well, far be it for me to push my morality on people who lived 500 years ago. Anyway, well, simultaneously, an incident involving a locket with Henry's portrait, which Jane flaunted in Anne's presence, reportedly provoked Anne to violent anger, and one can hardly blame her. Jane was apparently showing off. Look at this little present that I got. From your husband, nonetheless. What are you going to do about it? Well, Anne, of course. No one can blame her for acting in a very violent manner, symbolizing a growing desperation and also this complete loss of control over her circumstances. The clock was certainly ticking on Anne living the good life. Well, Anne miscarried in January 1536, shortly after witnessing an intimate moment between Henry and Jane. This, of course, was a devastating blow for everybody involved. The loss of what was reported to be a male fetus coincided tragically with the day of Catherine's burial, intensifying the personal and political implications of her failed pregnancy. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, ominously noted the miscarriage of her savior, suggesting that the event marked the beginning of the end for Anne's marriage to Henry. You see, if there was a male heir, effectively for Anne it would be obligation fulfilled. But another disappointment in Henry's eyes, well, that was the nail in the coffin for poor Anne. One can only feel sorry. Well, Henry's reaction to the miscarriage further alienated Anne. There was no shoulder to cry on. There was no sympathy. He claimed that he had been seduced into the marriage by sortileges, implying deception or enchantment. This accusation set the stage for Jane Seymour's elevation within the court. So Jane was moved into the royal quarters, a sign of her rising favor, while Anne's influence rapidly diminished. Additionally, Anne's brother, George Boleyn, was notably passed over for the Order of the Garter, which was instead awarded to Sir Nicholas Carow, further indicating the shifting allegiances. And thus, like that, Anne Boleyn's downfall was swift and dramatic, and historians have long debated the forces behind her arrest and execution. Now, it's been suggested that Anne and Cromwell, that being Thomas Cromwell, had significant disagreements over the redistribution of church revenues and foreign policy, which escalated tensions between them also. Anne favored using the revenues for charitable and educational purposes, and sought an alliance with France. After all, she had plenty of friends back there. But Cromwell aimed to refill the king's depleted coffers, and preferred an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. The evidence suggesting Cromwell's involvement in engineering Anne's fall includes his conversations with the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, which indicate Cromwell as the instigator of the plot against her. However, Cromwell's biographer, John Schofield, disputes this, asserting that there is no substantial evidence of a Cromwell-led conspiracy. Schofield argues that Cromwell only became involved in Anne's case by direct order from Henry VIII, and that the supposed power struggle between Anne and Cromwell had been based on unreliable sources. So now, let's talk more about these final days of Anne Boleyn. Well, the events leading up to Anne's arrest begin with the arrest of one Mark Smeaton, who was a musician in her service, who initially denied but later confessed to being her lover, possibly under torture and the promise of freedom. Now, following his confession, other men, including Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and Sir William Brereton, and Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested on charges of adultery with the Queen and related treasonous acts. Norris, despite being treated with initial kindness by Henry VIII, was arrested during May Day festivities, likely triggered by Smeaton's confession. Of course, he vehemently denied the charges, as did all of the others accused. Now, just quickly, we mentioned that one Mark Smeaton was a musician. Interesting fact, there were a lot of lute players, musicians and the like in medieval times that would, of course, go into courts and entertain. And actually, a few of them were spies. Think about it. The lute player sitting in the corner, hours and hours, the life of the party, providing all the entertainment. Well, as everybody gets drunker and drunker, they begin to talk, and they begin to brag, and they begin to one-up each other on their plans. Well, the lute player just keeps on playing and takes the information in. Of course, he's just there to play music, right? Who would suspect him? Anyway, maybe we'll have a video on medieval spies in the future. That's a good one. Well, back to Anne Boleyn. Of course, the legal proceedings against Anne were, at least by modern standards, completely unjust. The laws of the time were heavily weighted towards the desires of the monarchy, making the outcome a guilty verdict, pretty much 99% a foregone conclusion. This was exemplified in the charges laid against her, which included adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. The extremity and salaciousness of the charges were likely intended to ensure that no sympathy remained for Anne. A propaganda campaign, effectively, a smear campaign even, and it facilitated a swift execution. And then we arrive at May the 2nd, 1536. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, where she was held in the royal apartments. In a state of distress, she inquired about the whereabouts of her father and brother, and the specifics of the charges against her. And it was around this time that she wrote a rather solemn message to Henry, a letter, and we're fortunate enough to have the entire thing. I'm going to read it right now, of course. Sir, your Grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me, as what to write or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. Whereas you send unto me, willing me to confess a truth, and so obtain your favour by such an one, whom you know be my ancient professed enemy. I no sooner received this message by him, than I rightly conceive your meaning, and if you say confessing a truth indeed may procure my safety, I shall with all willingness and duty perform your demand. But let not your grace ever imagine that your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault, where not so much as a thought thereof proceeded. And to speak a truth, neither prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection that you have ever found in Anne Boleyn, with which name and place I could willingly have contented myself, if God and your grace's pleasure had been so pleased. Neither did I at any time so far forget myself in exaltation or received queenship, but that I always looked for such an alteration as I now find, for the ground of my preferment being one so sure a foundation than your grace's fancy. The least alteration I knew was fit and sufficient to draw that fancy to some other object. You have chosen me, from a low estate, to be your queen and your companion, far beyond my desert or desire. If then you found me worthy of such a honour, good your grace let not any light fancy, or bad counsel of mine enemies, withdraw your princely favour of me. Neither let that stain, that unworthy stain, of a disloyal heart toward your good grace ever cast so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife and the infant princess, your daughter. Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges. Yea, let me receive an open trial, for my truth shall fear no open flame. Then you shall see either my innocence is cleared, your suspicion and conscience satisfied, the ignominy and slander of the world stopped, or my guilt openly declared. So that, whatsoever God or you may determine of me, your grace may be freed of an open censure, and mine offence being so lawfully proved, your grace is at liberty, both before God and man, not only to execute worthy punishment on me as an unlawful wife, but to follow your affection, already settled on that party, for whose sake I am now as I am, whose name I could some good while since have pointed unto you, your grace being not ignorant of my suspicion therein. But if you have already determined of me, and that not only my death, but as infamous slander must bring you enjoying your desired happiness, then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sin therein, and likewise mine enemies the instruments thereof, and that he will not call you to a strict account of your unprincely and cruel usage of me. At his general judgment seat, where both you and myself must shortly appear, and in whose judgment I doubt not whatsoever the world may think of me, mine innocence shall be openly known and sufficiently cleared. My last and my only request shall be, that myself may only bear the burden of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of these poor gentlemen, who, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake. If I ever find favour in your sight, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn hath been pleasing to your ears, then let me obtain this request, and I will so leave to trouble your grace any further. With mine earnest prayers to the Trinity, to have your grace in his good keeping, and to direct you in all your actions. From my doleful prison in the Tower, this 6th of May, your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn. Gee, that was a bit sad, wasn't it? I thought so, certainly if you didn't. Well, Anne Boleyn's final days were marked by both a dignified composure and a tragic poignancy. Following her conviction on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason, a trial that has been widely criticized for its complete lack of evidence, Anne faced her execution with a blend of bravery and resignation. Her trial and the subsequent events show the harsh reality of Tudor politics, where personal vendettas and politics more often than not overshadowed justice. May 12, 1536. Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and Sir Henry Norris were tried and, except for Smeaton, who pleaded guilty, possibly under duress, all maintained their innocence. Nevertheless, they were convicted and executed. Just days later, Anne and her brother George Boleyn were tried before a jury of peers, including her former fiancé Henry Percy, who was visibly devastated by the proceedings. The jury found Anne guilty, no surprises there, and Percy's reaction underscored the widespread belief among many that the trial was unjust. The day before her execution, Anne exhibited a calm acceptance of her fate. She met with Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, and expressed a poignant readiness for death, noting wryly that she had a little neck, i.e., it would be easy to cut her head off. Well, her final hours were spent in prayer and reflection, reaffirming her innocence right up to the moment of her death. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold erected on the north side of the White Tower. Dressed in a red petticoat and a grey damask gown trimmed with fur, she addressed the gathered crowd with grace, urging them to maintain their loyalty to the king and absolving her accusers. Her speech, as recorded in various accounts, including John Fox's Acts and Monuments, showed her magnanimity and her subtle insistence on her innocence. The French poet Lancelot de Carle, who was present in London at the time, later wrote a detailed account of the event, capturing the sombre mood of those present and the dignified manner in which Anne addressed the onlookers. Thus, her execution was so profoundly solemn and a dramatic moment, this May 19th, 1536, that it was attended by all of the notable members of the court and the city's officialdom. She composed herself with dignity, removing her ermine mantle and headdress, and tucking her hair under a coif. In a poignant farewell to her weeping ladies-in-waiting, she asked for prayers, and then she knelt down, blindfolded, to meet her fate in the French style of upright kneeling, less common in England, where the block was typically used. She fervently uttered in these last moments, "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The executioner, a skilled swordsman from Saint Omer, was tasked to carry out the beheading with a single stroke, a task he executed with precision, thus sparing Anne from further suffering. A quick death. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the confines of the Tower of London, where her remains were identified during renovations in 1876. The reinterment in 1877 finally provided a marked grave in the chapel, acknowledging her resting place, though controversy and speculation about the identity of the remains, as suggested by some modern historians, regarding a possibility of a mix-up with Catherine Howard adds a little mystery to the story. All in all, her execution and subsequent treatment of her legacy reflect the turbulent and often brutal nature of Tudor politics, as well as the personal tragedies and vendetta that played out at the highest levels of English royalty. It was a life and a death that marked not only the end of a queen, but also set the stage for significant shifts in England, the effects of which would resonate through the reigns of her daughter, Elizabeth I, and beyond. Well, thank you very much. Jane Seymour, the daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, believed to have been born in Wolfhall, Wiltshire, but the exact date of her birth is unknown. Different sources suggest a range from 1504 to perhaps 1509, but nowadays common scholarship generally assumes it to be around 1508. She was a direct descendant of Lionel of Antwerp, the first Duke of Clarence, through her maternal grandfather, who was related to King Edward III. Consequently, Elizabeth and King Henry VIII were fifth cousins. Additionally, she had a common ancestor, Elizabeth Cheney, with both his second and fifth wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Now, Jane possessed a lower level of education compared to Henry's previous wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Although she possessed basic literacy skills, her true strengths were in her mastery of needlework and her adeptness in managing household affairs, which were seen quite a bit more essential for women. According to reports, her needlework was exceptionally exquisite and intricate. Some of it even remained in existence until 1652, when it was documented to have been presented to the Seymour family. Following her demise, it was observed that Henry possessed a fervent passion for embroidery. Jane assumed the role of maid of honor to Queen Catherine in 1532. But she may have started serving her as early as 1527. She then continued her service to Queen Anne alongside her sister Elizabeth. And Henry's initial attraction to Jane was documented in February of 1536, which was around 3 months before the execution of Anne Boleyn. Well, Jane received abundant acclaim for her serene and tranquil disposition, apparently the loveliest to be around. Indeed, John Russell described her as the gentlest lady he had ever known, while the imperial ambassador Eustace Shappey, who referred to her as Jane Seymour in his correspondence, called her the Pacific because of her attempts to promote peace at court. Shappey described her as being of average height and having a very pale complexion. He also mentioned that she was not particularly beautiful. But of course, the personality is what counts. Just ask Henry. Well, however, Russell claimed that she was the most beautiful among all of the king's wives. I suppose it's all in the eye of the beholder. Polydore Virgil remarked that she possessed an exceptional allure in terms of both personality and physical attractiveness, but in general she was perceived as timid, kind, virtuous, and all in all uncomplicated. And her extended family led others to believe that she would be capable of having numerous children, which, well, that was Henry's mission, of course, chasing that coveted male heir. So, Henry VIII became engaged to Jane on the 20th of May, 1536, which was the day following the execution of Anne Boleyn. Their marriage took place on the 30th of May, 1536, at the Palace of Whitehall in London, specifically in the Queen's Closet. And just remember, at the time, all the way up to Anne Boleyn's execution, Anne was still writing him those very pitiful letters, saying that she still loved him and all the rest. All very sad. So Jane knew exactly what she was getting into. She chose him. Well, the ceremony was officiated by Bishop Gardiner, and as a wedding gift he bestowed upon her 104 manors in 4 counties, together with several forests and hunting grounds, to provide her with an annual income to sustain her throughout the marriage. Well, on the 4th of June, 1536, she was officially declared queen in a public manner. Her widely known empathy for the deceased Queen Catherine and her daughter Mary demonstrated her more sensitive nature, which made her highly regarded among the general public and the majority of her courtiers. Due to the outbreak of plague in London at the time, the coronation ceremony, where she was supposed to be crowned, never actually took place, and Henry may have hesitated to crown her until she had completed her obligation as queen consort by giving birth to a male heir for him. Remember, by this point he was getting a little impatient, to say the least. Jane, as queen, was reputed to possess a severe and formal demeanor, which was a bit of a departure from her pre-royal days. The opulent festivities, merriment, and excessive spending of the Queen's household, which had reached its zenith during Anne Boleyn's era, were substituted with stringent propriety. She prohibited the French styles that Anne had introduced, and her political stance seems to have been, all in all, quite conservative. In 1536, she made a request for pardons for those involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was her sole recorded engagement in national matters. According to reports, Henry refused this, warning her of the consequences that her predecessor faced when she had interfered in his matters. We all know what happened to her. As a queen, her motto was bound to obey and serve. So, couldn't really get along too well with the husband. The next best thing is the stepdaughter, Mary, and she cultivated quite a strong bond with her, actively working to ensure that Mary would be reinstated in court and included in the line of succession, even if Jane were to have children with Henry. Well, she raised the matter of Mary's restoration on multiple occasions, both prior to and following her ascension to the throne. Although she could not reinstate Mary in the line of succession, she successfully reconciled her with Henry. Chapis corresponded with Emperor Charles V, informing him of her empathy and diligent actions in support of Mary's reinstatement. Mary's letter expresses her thanks towards her. Although Mary and Elizabeth were first excluded from the succession, it was Catherine Parr, Mary's 6th and final wife, who ultimately persuaded him to reinstate them after being urged by Mary to do so. Well, according to one historical source, it is speculated that she might have been pregnant and experienced a miscarriage around Christmas in the year of 1536. But eventually, a child was born, and that was Edward, the sole male heir of Henry VIII who managed to survive infancy. Of course, both of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were in attendance in carrying Edward's train during the ceremony. But Jane's labour was arduous, enduring for a duration of 48 hours, likely due to the baby's unfavourable positioning. And, well, she didn't make it. Jane was interred on the 12th of November 1537 at St. George's Chapel at Windsor, following the funeral, during which her stepdaughter Mary served as the principal mourner. Following her demise, Henry donned black attire for a duration of 3 months. During his time as a widower, he gained weight and became obese. I'm sure you've seen the pictures. He's a big boy, experiencing swelling and getting both diabetes and gout. Well, it didn't take him too long to find a new wife. And thus we arrive at wife number 4, which is quite an interesting one, Anne of Cleaves. Anne was born in 1515, between the 22nd of September and the 28th of June. She was born in Dusseldorf, that's right, not in England, as the second daughter of John III of the House of Lamarck. Now, John III had various titles, including Duke of Juric-Uxoris, the Duke of Cleaves, and the Duke of Bers-Juric-Uxoris, along with the Count of Mark and a few others. Anne's father was swayed by Erasmus and adhered to a moderate approach with the Reformation. He opted to align himself with the Schmalkaldic League and actively resisted Emperor Charles V, that is Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, by the way. Now, following John's demise, Anne's sibling William ascended to the title of Duke of Jülich-Cleves-Berg, earning the notable nickname the Rich. I hope I can get that nickname one day. Well, in 1526, Sibyl, the older sister of the person in question, wedded John Frederick, the Elector of Saxony and leader of the Protestant Confederation of Germany, who was widely regarded as the foremost advocate of the Reformation movement. So there's the background, politics of the Holy Roman Empire. It's always good fun, and it's always quite complicated. Well, in terms of Anne, at the tender age of 11 years old in 1527, she was engaged to Francis, the 9-year-old son and future inheritor of Antoine, the Duke of Lorraine. However, due to Francis being below the legal age of consent, 10 years old, glad we raised that one when the agreement was made, the betrothal was deemed unofficial and thus terminated in 1535. While her brother William identified as a Lutheran, the rest of the family did not have a specific religious affiliation. However, her mother, the Duchess Maria, was known to be a staunch Catholic. Due to her father's continuous struggle over Gelderland with Charles V, her family became acceptable friends for England's King Henry VIII after the Truce of Nice. The king's senior minister, Thomas Cromwell, strongly encouraged the match with Anne. Now, Hans Holbein the Younger was sent to Düren to create pictures of Anne and her younger sister Amalia, both of whom Henry VIII was contemplating as potential candidates as his 4th bride. Henry instructed the artist to prioritize accuracy over flattering the sisters. The portraits are currently housed in the Musée du Louvre in Paris and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. You can still go and see them. Trinity College in Cambridge also houses a 1539 picture created by the school of Bathel Bruin the Elder. Well, the negotiations to arrange the marriage were actively underway by the March of 1539. Thomas Cromwell supervised the negotiations, and the marriage treaty was officially agreed upon on the 4th of October in that same year. Henry esteemed knowledge and cultural refinement in women, such as Anne Boleyn. However, Anne did not possess these qualities in the amount that he desired. You see, despite lacking formal schooling, she possessed expertise in needlework and enjoyed engaging in card games. She possessed the ability to comprehend and produce written language, specifically in German. However, Anne, on the other hand, was seen as mild, chaste. This is Anne of Cleaves, rather, and also meek, making her a highly suggested choice for Henry. Now, according to the French envoy Charles de Marillac, Anne was characterized as being tall and slender, with a moderate level of attractiveness. I doubt there's many women who like to be described like that. But she was also described as having highly confident and determined facial expression. She had blonde hair and was reputed to possess a beautiful countenance. Well, at least by English standards, she had a somber demeanor and appeared older than her actual age. Holbein depicted her with a prominent forehead, eyes that were partially closed, and a chin that came to a point. Now, Anne had originally planned to travel to England alone with her entourage. However, due to the loss of her father, her brother and mother were unable to accompany her. There were apprehensions about the safety of a young and attractive woman, even if she was only moderately attractive, who had never been by sea undertaking such a voyage, particularly during the winter season. She journeyed from Dusseldorf to Cleaves, and subsequently to Antwerp, where she was welcomed by a group of 50 English merchants. Henry personally encountered her on New Year's Day 1540 at Rochester Abbey in Rochester, while she was travelling from Dover. He and a group of his courtiers, in accordance with a courtly love custom, entered the room where Anne was residing while wearing disguises. Eustace Chaves provided a report. The king so went up to the chamber, where the said Lady Anne was looking out of a window to see the bull baiting which was going on in the courtyard, and he suddenly embraced and kissed her, and showed her a token which the king had sent her for New Year's gift, and she, being abashed and not knowing who it was, thanked him, and so he spoke with her, but she regarded him little, but always looked out the window, and when the king saw that she took so little notice of his coming, he went into another chamber, took off his cloak, and came in again in a coat of purple velvet. And when the lords and knights saw his grace, they did him reverence. End of the account. Now, based on the accounts of Henry's associates, he had actually expressed a dissatisfaction with Anne, perceiving her to be different from what was previously stated. Did not look like the picture. As chronicler Charles Wriothesley noted, Anne showed very little regard for him, but it is uncertain whether she was aware that he was actually the king. Subsequently, Henry disclosed his actual persona to Anne, and despite her alleged reservations, the arrangements for their marriage continued. Henry and Anne had their official meeting on the 3rd of January at Blackheath. A lavish feast was arranged for the occasion. Now, the majority of historians think that Henry's reservations about marriage stemmed from Anne's unappealing physical appearance. I mean, think about it. If you are going to describe a woman as moderately beautiful, that's usually to spare some feelings. I mean, you feel bad for her a little bit. But to use the term, she's moderately good looking, well, we all know what that means. Either way, it failed to arouse his desire to consummate the union. He experienced a sense of deception when his counselors lauded Anne's beauty, stating, I quote, "She does not possess the level of attractiveness that was previously described." Well, he went on to inform others in the court that if it were not for the fact that she had travelled so far to his kingdom and the extensive preparations and ceremonial arrangement that his people had made for her, and fear for causing a disturbance in the world and pushing her brother into the arms of the emperor and the French king, he would not be marrying her at all. However, at this point, it was past the point of no return. Now, Cromwell was held partially responsible for the Holbein image, that picture that was presented originally that roused Henry's attentions, as Henry considered that it did not accurately depict Anne, and for some of the overblown accounts of her attractiveness. Well, it was all seemingly a lie. Well, Henry implored Cromwell to discover the lawful method to circumvent the marriage. However, at this juncture, accomplishing this task was unattainable without jeopardizing the crucial relationship with the Germans. Of course, I don't think the Germans could see the funny side in it. Well, driven by his intense wrath and fury, the king directed his attention towards Cromwell, a decision he would later come to regret. Well, notwithstanding Henry's explicit reservations, the couple were wedded on the 6th of January 1540 at the regal palace of Placentia in Greenwich, London. Anne's wedding ring bore the inscription, "God send me well to keep." Edward Hall reported that she was dressed in a luxurious gown composed of gold fabric, adorned with huge flowers and valuable pearls, designed in the round fashion of the duchy. A circular gown did not have a train. Following the wedding, jousting events took place on the subsequent Sunday. Anne was attired in the English style, with a French hood. Well, the big night was here. The romance was about to begin. However, their wedding night was not triumphant. Henry had disclosed the morning after that he had not consummated the marriage at all, expressing, I quote, "I didn't like her before, but now I like her even less." Now, I don't want to besmirch the poor lady, but apparently Henry was turned off by, well, the smell of her. We don't want to go into too much detail, but that was apparently the problem. Apparently it was so off-putting that he quoted that he did not have the courage to go through with it. My God. Well, moving beyond that, Anne was basically ordered to depart from the court on the 24th of June, and on the 6th of July she was notified of her husband's choice to reassess the marriage. Testimonies were obtained from several courtiers and 2 physicians, documenting the king's dissatisfaction with her appearance and the other problems. Henry expressed his disbelief to Thomas Heneage and Anthony Denny on the state of the woman in question. Well, soon after, Anne was requested to give her agreement for an annulment, to which she willingly accepted. Cromwell, who was the driving force behind the marriage, was convicted of treason. The marriage was invalidated on the 12th of July 1540 due to lack of consummation, and of course they found out about that little prior agreement to marry Francis of Lorraine, just tipping the scales a little bit. Well, according to Henry's physician, following the wedding night, Henry claimed that he was not impotent because he had experienced 2 nocturnal emissions during sleep. Well, January 1540, Anne received dower estates to finance her household, which included the manors in Hampshire which were previously owned by Bremore Priory and Southwick Priory. Being the former queen, she was granted a substantial settlement, which included Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the residence of Henry's former in-laws, the Boleyns. Anne of Cleaves' house, located in Lewes, East Sussex, is among the numerous buildings owned by Anne of Cleves, despite her never having even resided there. Well, after this, Henry and Anne had a cordial relationship. She held a special position in the king's family and was given the title the king's beloved sister. During her decision to not challenge the annulment, Henry, as a gesture of appreciation, granted her the privilege of being ranked higher than any other women in England, except, of course, for his new wife and daughters. In March 1547, Edward VI's Privy Council requested her relocation from Bletchingley Palace, her customary abode, to Penshurst Palace in order to accommodate Thomas Cowardin, the master of revels. They indicated that Penshurst was closer to Hever, and the relocation was in accordance with the wishes of Henry VIII. On August 4th, 1553, Anne sent a letter to Mary I to express her congratulations on her marriage to Philip of Spain, and on September 28th, 1553, Mary departed from St. James's Palace to go to Whitehall, where she was joined by her sister Elizabeth and Anne of Cleves. Anne additionally participated in Mary's coronation procession and potentially attended her crowning at Westminster Abbey. These are likely to have been her final appearances. However, there is a record of Anne being presented at Westminster Abbey in August of 1554, following the marriage of Mary and Philip. Due to the new queen's strong adherence to Catholicism, Anne once again converted to Roman Catholicism. Well, upon Anne's declining health, Mary granted her permission to reside in the Chelsea Old Manor, which had previously been inhabited by Henry's final spouse, Catherine Parr, following her remarriage, of course. Well, in July of 1557, Anne dictated her final will. She refers to her sibling's spouse, as well as the upcoming Queen Elizabeth, the Duchess of Suffolk, and the Countess of Arundel. She bequeathed a sum of money to her slaves, and requested Mary and Elizabeth hire them for their own families, and treat them well. She was widely recognized by all who served her as a very benevolent and even quite a laid-back mistress. And thus, Anne had passed away at Chelsea Old Manor on the 16th of July, 1557. Cancer was the most probable factor contributing to her death. Well, and that is the life of Anne of Cleves. And now we get to the fifth wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Howard. A little bit more detail from now on. Well, Catherine Howard, she was born in 1523. Once again, precise dates uncertain. Well, regrettably, her early upbringing was marred by the often imprudent, to say the least, choices made by her father, Edmund Howard. You see, as the son of a prominent family, Edmund's options were restricted to depending on the benevolence of his wealthier relatives as his own capability to create his path. Regrettably, he exhibited excessive pride and was extravagant with his spending. And we all know what happens when you spend beyond your means. Well, the insult he made towards the king and the subsequent events would progressively deteriorate and gradually entangle him as well as his family in a web that they could simply not get out from. He acquired a compulsive gambling habit that posed a constant risk of being imprisoned for unpaid debts, leading him to flee and hide on several occasions. In fact, in 1527, he wrote a letter to Wolsey expressing his desperation and imploring Wolsey to be his benefactor, as he believes that without Wolsey's kind assistance he would face complete ruin. Well, if Cardinal Wolsey had provided assistance to the family in response to that letter, for which there is scant evidence that he did, the cash was received in small and irregular amounts and would have likely been insufficient. Well, the family experienced their most challenging period between 1524 and 31, which aligns with the birth of the early years of Catherine Howard. This portrayal suggests that the girl is probably neglected and possibly even unwanted, as her birth implies the need to gather funds for a future dowry. Catherine's early upbringing was characterized by a lack of stability and certainty, which explains why she is frequently described as having limited literacy skills and a genuine lack of education. You see, her father plainly did not prioritize her, especially when it came to her schooling and her future in general. Thus, in 1531, Catherine received assistance indirectly from her cousin, the future Queen, Anne Boleyn, who intervened on her behalf. Well, either as a result of her mother Joyce's demise in 1528, her family's financial difficulties, or Catherine's approaching the age for wardship, Catherine's family was effectively disbanded in 1531, when she was approximately 8 years old. Catherine and her brother Henry were placed under the guardianship of Agnes Howard, their step-grandmother and the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, while 2 of her older sisters were married off. The Duchess oversaw extensive households at Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, and at Norfolk House in Lambeth. These households accommodated numerous staff and also housed numerous wards, who were mostly the children of impoverished aristocratic relatives. Although it was customary for European nobility to transfer young children to aristocratic houses for education and training, it seems that both Chesworth House and Lambeth had, inadequate supervision. The Dowager Duchess frequently attended court, but had a minimal direct role in the raising of her wards and her young female servants. Now, around 1536, Catherine initiated music instruction with 2 tutors, of which one being Henry Mano, which the Duchess's residence in Horsham. Subsequently, a romantic involvement ensued between them. Now, the precise age of Mano at the time was uncertain. Recent claims on his age suggest that he was in his late 30s, possibly around 36. However, these assertions lack backing from Catherine's biographers. There is evidence suggesting that Mano was still unmarried. Either way, given his background, it would have been extremely uncommon for someone in his position to be unmarried into their late 30s. Well, he entered into matrimony during the late 1530s, maybe 1539. Additionally, there is some indication that he was of the same age as the other two individuals employed in the household, including his cousin Edward Waldegrave, who was in his late teens or early 20s from 1536 to 38. Now, the specifics and chronology of this relationship are disputed among contemporary historians. It's been suggested that Catherine became more and more disgusted by Mano's insistence on engaging in sexual activity with her, and was infuriated with his habit of discussing the intimate aspects of their relationship with the household staff. That's a big no-no. You can't do that. Well, during Catherine's adultery investigations when she was King Henry's wife, both Manox and Catherine admitted to engaging in sexual contact, but they denied having actual intercourse. When interrogated, Catherine had stated, under the charming and reasonable influence of Mano, despite being a young girl, she allowed him on several occasions to touch and handle intimate parts of her body, which was neither appropriate for her to allow, nor was it for him to request. Well, Catherine terminated all communication with Mano in 1538, perhaps during the spring season. Contrary to occasional claims, it is not accurate to say that this occurred because she started to increase her time spent at the Dowager Duchess's residence in Lambeth. Lambeth was Mano's local parish, and it's possible that he got married there, possibly 1538 or 39. Well, soon after, Catherine was chased by Francis Derham, a secretary of the Dowager Duchess, and they purportedly entered into a romantic relationship, referring to each other as husband and wife. Derham also assigned Catherine with additional responsibilities expected of a wife, such as managing his finances during business trips. A significant number of Catherine's roommates, who were part of the Dowager Duchess's maids of honor, were attendants, well aware of the relationship, all of them. Well, however, it came to an end in 1539, when the Dowager Duchess discovered it. However, it's possible that Catherine and Derham separated with the purpose of being married when he came back from Ireland, after consenting to a pre-contract of marriage. Now, if they had, in fact, exchanged vows prior to engaging in sexual intercourse, they would have been regarded rather, as married, at least according to the Church's perspective. Well, Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, secured her a position inside the household of the king's fourth wife, Anne of Cleaves. As a youthful and appealing lady-in-waiting, Catherine swiftly attracted the attention of several men, including the king himself and Thomas Culpeper. During the initial phase of her tenure at court, before Anne of Cleves arrived, that is, there has been no discussion about her connection between the king and Catherine. Well, either way, he displayed an evident attraction towards her, and even when they were together, they openly engaged in flirtatious behavior. However, it seems that their relationship did not progress beyond that. Upon Anne's arrival, the king's lack of interest in her created a gradual chance for Catherine. Now, what about Thomas Culpeper? Well, up until this point, they had developed a quasi-relationship, but it seems to have not been an intimate one. However, based on later evidence, Culpeper did anticipate that it would soon become so. He expressed his love for Catherine, although it was likely driven more by lust than genuine affection. Catherine declined the offer. She was a good girl, prompting him to pursue another woman that was also part of the household. But you see, Catherine was profoundly disturbed by all of this, as it seems that she did have some degree of affection for him at that time, and on one occasion she even cried in front of her other maids of honor over all the stress of it. You see, before this occurrence, she had the power to determine the duration of her relationships and decide whether or if at all they would come to an end. As the king's fascination with Catherine intensified, the House of Norfolk's sway also increased. The middle-aged king found her youth, beauty, and liveliness to be quite compelling, stating that he had never encountered a lady quite like her before. On 28th of July, 1540, King Henry and Catherine were wedded by Bishop Bonner of London at Oatlands Palace, coinciding with the day of Cromwell's execution. She was an adolescent, while he was 49 years old. Wow, that sure is something. The marriage was publicly announced on the 8th of August, and religious invocations were recited in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. Henry catered to her every need due to her reportedly unpredictable and impulsive behavior. Catherine was youthful, exuberant, and unburdened by worries. Of course, the king, well, he was quite thrilled too. He indulged in an extravagant spending spree to commemorate the marriage, undertaking substantial renovations and enhancements at the Palace of Whitehall. Subsequently, there were more lavish presents given for Christmas at Hampton Court Palace. But during that winter, the king's negative moods intensified, and he became increasingly irascible, partly due to the discomfort caused by his ulcerous legs. Well, he accused the councillors of being deceitful and self-serving individuals, and started to feel remorse for carrying out the execution of Cromwell. Well, following a gloomy and melancholic march, his spirits seemed to have been elevated somewhat during the Easter. Preparations were made to detect any indications of a royal pregnancy. And, well, there was one that was reported on the 15th of April. Well, if it was confirmed, well, the plan was to have her officially crowned. Catherine's potential involvement, however, with Thomas Culpeper, that favoured male courtier of King Henry during the marriage, is suggested by Derham's later evidence. You see, Culpeper was described as a young man who had taken Henry's place in the Queen's heart. During her tenure as a maid of honour to Anne of Cleaves, she had actually contemplated entering matrimony with Culpeper instead. Now, individuals who asserted to have observed her previous sexual conduct during her residence in Lambeth allegedly reached out to her, seeking favours in exchange for their silence. Blackmail, effectively. It is possible that some of these extortionists were subsequently appointed to her royal household, John Lascelles, a supporter of Cromwell, informed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, that his sister Mary declined to join Queen Catherine's household. Mary claimed to have observed the Queen Catherine's promiscuous behaviour while they were residing together at Lambeth. Cranmer proceeded to question Mary Lascelles, who claimed that Catherine had indeed been intimate while under the guardianship of the Duchess of Norfolk with another prior to her involvement to the king. Well, Cranmer promptly undertook the case to overthrow his adversaries, the Roman Catholic Norfolk family. Lady Rochford had an interrogation too, and, apprehensive of potential torture, acquiesced to divulging information. She recounted on how she had kept a lookout for Catherine using the back stairs, while Culpeper managed to flee from the Queen's room. Well, during the investigation, a romantic letter penned in the Queen's unique handwriting was also discovered in Culpeper's quarters. This is the last remaining letters of hers, apart from her subsequent confession. Well, November 1st, 1541, the king deliberately positioned himself in the Chapel Royal, engaged in prayer and observance of All Saints' Day. He was presented with a letter detailing the accusations against Catherine. On November 7th, 1541, Archbishop Cranmer led a group of advisers to Winchester Palace in Southwark in order to interrogate Mary. Even the unwavering Cranmer felt the teenage Catherine's distressed and confused situation to be deserving of pity, expressing that he discovered her in such a sorrow and sadness that he had never witnessed in any person, to the extent in that it would have evoked sympathy in anyone who beheld her. He commanded the guards to confiscate any items that she could potentially employ to carry out self-harm. Proving the existence of pre-contact between Catherine and Derham would have resulted in the termination of Catherine's marriage to Henry. However, it would have also given Henry the opportunity to annul their marriage and exile Catherine from the court, condemning her to a life of poverty and disgrace, instead of executing her. It is worth noting that there is no evidence suggesting Henry would have opted for this alternative, but the alternative was there. Well, at first, when confronted, Catherine openly admitted her relationship with Derham, but later she consistently denied any prior agreement, asserting that Derham had actually sexually assaulted her. Catherine was deposed from her position as queen on the 23rd of November 1541, and confined in the newly established Sion Abbey, located in Middlesex. Culpeper and Derham were charged with high treason and brought before the Guildhall on the 1st of December 1541. Culpeper was killed by beheading, and Derham was executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering at Tyburn on the 10th of December 1541. As per tradition, their heads were mounted on spikes on London Bridge. A significant number of Catherine's family were likewise apprehended in the Tower, sent to trial, convicted on the offence as concealing treason, and therefore sentenced to lifelong incarceration and confiscation of their possessions. Catherine's status remained uncertain until Parliament enacted a bill of attainder on the 29th of July 1542, which was subsequently approved on the 7th of February 1542. The Royal Assent by Commission Act 1541 established that it was an act of treason punishable by death for a Queen Consort to withhold information about her past from the monarch within 20 days of their marriage, or to encourage somebody to commit adultery with her. While this action effectively resolved the issue of Catherine's alleged pre-contact and, established her as 100% guilty. But there was no official trial conducted. Well, the writing was on the wall now. Prior to her execution, Catherine is said to have dedicated numerous hours to perfecting the technique of positioning her head on the block, which was provided to her upon her specific demand. She passed away with a certain level of calmness, but appeared pale and filled with fear. Apparently she needed help to ascend up onto the scaffold. Contrary to the popular belief, there is no credible evidence to support her claim that the last words were, "I died a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." I really wish she had have said that, though. Eyewitness accounts instead confirmed that she adhered to rather conventional final words. God forgive me, all that sort of thing. The boring stuff. She sought forgiveness for her sins and acknowledged that she deserved severe punishment for betraying the king, who had always treated her with great kindness. And then the axe came down, and her head rolled off into the little basket. And that was the end of the life of Catherine Howard. And now, the final wife of Henry VIII, Catherine Parr. Born in 1512, the first daughter of Sir Thomas Parr, who unfortunately passed away during her childhood, leading her to develop a strong bond with her mother, Maud Parr, as she matured. Catherine's early education paralleled that of other privileged ladies, but she cultivated an enthusiasm that endured for acquiring knowledge in general. She possessed fluency in French, Latin, which she also engaged in composition of that language, and Italian. Additionally, she commenced the acquisition of the Spanish language, subsequent to assuming the role of queen. Biographer Linda Porter suggests that the account of Catherine expressing her aversion to sewing as a child and proclaiming that her hands were meant for crowns and scepters rather than spindles and needles is most likely to be a later tale made up, apocryphal. But we do know that by the age of 17 in 1529, Catherine entered into marriage with Sir Edward Burrough, who was the grandson of Edward Burrough, the second Baron. Prior biographies erroneously state that Catherine had wedded the elder Burgh, but this is not the case. So, after the death of the second Baron Burrough in December of 1528, Sir Thomas Burrough, Catherine's father-in-law, was called to Parliament in 1529 and became the new Baron Burrough. A little complicated, I know. Catherine's initial spouse was in his 20s and potentially suffered from ailing physical conditions. He acted as a trustee for Thomas Giddel and held the position of magistrate. In addition, his father and son obtained a joint patent for the position of steward of the manor of Soke of Cureton in Lindsey, which included survivorship rights. Sir Edward Burrough, the younger, passed away in the spring of 1533, before being able to receive the title of Baron Burrough. So, first husband, away he goes, off to the next world, and after the death of him, Catherine Parr possibly visited the Dowager Lady Strickland, Catherine Neville, who was the widow of Catherine's cousin Sir Walter Strickland at the Stricklands' ancestral home in Caesar Castle in Westmoreland, which is now in Cumbria. In the summer of 1534, Catherine entered into a second marriage with John Neville, the third Baron Latimer, who was not only her father's second cousin, but also related to Lady Strickland. Catherine's marriage made her the second lady in the Parr family to marry into the peerage. Now on to Latimer, who had been widowed twice, was almost twice Catherine's age, and he already had two children, John and Margaret, from his first marriage to Dorothy de Vere, who was the sister of John de Vere, the first Earl of Oxford. Despite Latimer's financial hardships resulting from his legal pursuit of the Earl of Warwick title alongside his siblings, Catherine now enjoyed the benefits of having her own residence, a noble title, and a husband who holds a prominent position, wielding influence in the northern region. Latimer was an advocate of the Catholic Church, and had objected to the king's initial annulment, his following union with Anne Boleyn, and resulting ecclesiastical implications. During the Lincolnshire Rising, in October of 1536, Catholic insurgents confronted the Latimers at their residence, coercively demanding Latimer's participation in their campaign to restore the connections between England and Rome. Catherine observed her spouse was forcefully pulled away. From October 1536 until April 1537, Catherine resided in solitude, filled with apprehension, while she cared for her stepchildren and faced numerous challenges to ensure her survival. During this period of uncertainty, Catherine's vehement response to the revolt likely reinforced her commitment to the Reformed Church of England. In January of 1537, Catherine and her stepchildren were taken captive at Snape Castle in North Yorkshire as part of the rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The insurgents looted the residence and conveyed a message to Lord Latimer, who was en route from London, stating that unless he promptly returned, they would execute his entire family. Probably best you get back quickly then. Well, upon Latimer's arrival to the castle, he successfully persuaded the rebels to release his family and leave. However, the consequences of this event and the trauma of it all proved to be mentally and emotionally draining for the entire family. I mean, it's certainly hard to forget an event like that, isn't it? Now, on to the King, Henry VIII, and Thomas Cromwell. Well, they received contradictory information regarding Latimer's status, with some reports suggesting he was a captive, while others claimed that he was actually involved in a conspiracy of his own. Now, this is a problem, because being involved in a conspiracy, well, that means that you're a traitor, and you could be convicted of such, resulting in the loss of properties. And Catherine and her stepchildren, well, they would be left without any money. And, well, that's the greatest tragedy of all, isn't it? Well, the monarch personally corresponded with Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, urging him to ensure that Latimer would denounce the malefactor Robert Aske and surrender to our leniency. Well, Latimer acquiesced. It is probable that Catherine's brother William Parr and her uncle William Parr, the first Baron Parr of Horton, who both opposed the revolt, interfered to save Latimer's life. Well, despite the absence of any formal allegations, Latimer's reputation, which had implications for Catherine, was permanently damaged throughout his lifetime. During the following 7 years, the Latimer family dedicated a significant portion of their time to the southern region. In 1542, the family resided in London, while Latimer participated in the proceedings of Parliament. Catherine paid a visit to her brother, William Parr, who held the title of First Marquess of Northampton, and her sister, Anne Parr, who was known as the Countess of Pembroke, while they were all at court. And it was here that Catherine met her eventual fourth husband, Sir Thomas Seymour. The ambience of the court starkly contrasted the rural estates that she was familiar with. Big city girl now, isn't she? Catherine had the opportunity to discover the most recent developments, and not just in matters of religion, but also in less significant worldly matters, like fashion and jewellery. Well, Lord Latimer, he had problems. His health had deteriorated by the winter of 1542. Catherine provided care for her husband until he passed away in 1543. She was designated as the guardian of his daughter Margaret, and entrusted with the responsibility of managing his affairs until the daughter reached adulthood. Latimer granted Catherine a life estate in the manor of Stowe in Northamptonshire, which is located 11 miles away from Horton, along with other holdings. In addition, he left a sum of money to provide financial support for his daughter. If his daughter failed to marry within a period of 5 years, Catherine was entitled to receive an annual allowance from the income to sustain herself. Well, she inherited a substantial fortune after her husband's passing, but with the demise of Lord Latimer, she confronted the prospect of having to relocate back to the northern region, and she didn't like that. Catherine certainly experienced genuine grief for her spouse, as evidenced by her continued possession of a New Testament book with his name written within, which she held until her passing. Catherine capitalized on her late mother's connection with Henry's initial consort, Catherine of Aragon, to re-establish her own bond with the daughter of the former Queen, Lady Mary. By the 16th of February, 1543, Catherine had integrated herself into Mary's household, and it was then that Catherine attracted the attention of the king. Despite initiating a loving relationship with Sir Thomas Seymour, the sibling of the deceased Queen Jane Seymour, she considered it an obligation to prioritize Henry's proposal over his. Bad luck for him, I suppose. Well, Seymour was assigned a position in Brussels as a means of relocating him away from the king's court. But maybe it was for the best. Nothing like a change of scenery, especially after a girl dumps you. Well, Catherine wedded Henry VIII on the 12th of July, 1543 at Hampton Court Palace, his 6th wedding. She was the inaugural monarch of England, who also held the title of Queen of Ireland after Henry adopted the designation of King of Ireland. Additionally, she was the 3rd spouse to have his name Catherine, albeit with different spelling in her autographs. You see, she didn't spell it in the normal way. She spelled it Kateryn, perhaps just to distinguish herself from the others. Well, Catherine and her newlywed husband had several shared royal and noble ancestors, which established them as cousins. Henry's mother and Catherine's father were third cousins once removed, as they shared a common ancestor, Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and Lady Joan Beaufort, who was the granddaughter of Edward III. Additionally, they were double fourth cousins once removed through their fathers, as they shared common ancestors, Thomas Holland, the 2nd Earl of Kent, and Lady Alice Fitzalan, the granddaughter of Henry, 3rd Earl of Lancaster, as well as John of Gaunt, the 1st Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, and Catherine Swynford. Now, I don't know about you. I haven't got a huge family, and I always struggle to work out this first cousin twice removed on the mother's side. It's not for me. It's not for me. Well, anyway, I digress. Upon ascending to the throne, Catherine appointed her former stepdaughter, Margaret Neville, as her lady-in-waiting. Additionally, she granted posts in her household to her niece Maud, Lady Lane, and Lady Somerset, the wife of her stepson John. Catherine played a significant role in facilitating the reconciliation between Henry and his daughters from his previous marriages. Additionally, she successfully cultivated a positive rapport with Henry's son, Edward. Upon ascending to the throne, Catherine appointed her uncle, Lord Parr of Horton, as her Lord Chamberlain. Parr's psalms or prayers extracted from the Holy Scriptures were published by the royal printer on April 25th, 1544. The translation of a Latin work by Bishop John Fisher circa 1525 was published anonymously and reissued on the 18th of April 1544. But Fisher was executed in 1535 due to his refusal to accept the oath of supremacy. Consequently, his name is absent from the title page. Now, Parr's publication emerged concurrently with the completion of war preparations, and it functioned as a potent instrument of wartime propaganda aimed at assisting Henry in his military campaign against France and Scotland by invoking the prayers of his subjects. The collection consists of 17 psalms, if we're going to use that terminology, primarily centered around vanquishing adversaries. It finishes with a prayer for the king, adopted from a prayer for the Holy Roman Emperor by George Witzel, and a prayer for men to say entering into battle, which is a translated version of a prayer by Erasmus. Parr purchased premium gift editions of the books that were printed on vellum and distributed among the court. The deluxe edition of the book contains notes made by Henry VIII himself, and the 9th psalm was written to existing music by Thomas Tallis and was probably performed during a special wartime service at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 22nd of May 1544. Parr's prayer for the king had significant posthumous impact. You see, in 1599, the text was revised and incorporated into the Book of Common Prayer, most likely by Elizabeth, who held the position of Supreme Governor of the Church of England at the time. This prayer is still included in the Book of Common Prayer and continues to be utilized by Anglican churches worldwide to offer prayers for the British monarch. Now, on to Henry. What's he up to? Well, he embarked on his final military expedition to France, lasting from July to September of 1544, while appointing Catherine as his regent. Due to the presence of friendly members on her regency council, such as Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Hertford, and her uncle William Parr, Lord Parr of Horton, who was added at her specific request, Catherine gained effective power and was able to govern according to her own discretion. Well, she managed the supply of resources, handled financial matters, and organized military gatherings for Henry's military expedition in France. And additionally, she authorized 5 official decrees on behalf of the monarchy and maintained regular communication with her subordinate Lord Shrewsbury, who was responsible for overseeing the volatile situation with Scotland in the northern borderlands. Her actions as regent, together with her strong character, dignity, and subsequent religious beliefs, are said to have had a significant impact on her stepdaughter, Lady Elizabeth, who would, of course, eventually become Elizabeth I of England. Now, Parr's second publication, titled Prayers or Meditations, was released in June of 1545. Similar to her initial book, it achieved significant commercial success. And in this instance, Parr employed an intricate compositional technique by revising the third book of Thomas A. Kemper's Imitatio Christi to create a monologue delivered by a non-specific Christian orator. The volume was also disseminated in handwritten manuscripts and high-quality printed copies. Princess Elizabeth rendered the book into Latin, Italian, and French as a New Year's offering for Henry VIII in December of 1545, and bestowed the manuscript in an exquisite hand-embroidered cover. The British Library now has a digitized version of the volume. You should be able to find it if you look it up. Now, onto the Queen's religious beliefs, which were regarded with mistrust by officials who opposed Protestantism, such as the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, and Lord Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor. Despite her Catholic upbringing, she subsequently developed an affinity for and curiosity for the new faith. By the mid-1540s, she became the subject of suspicion over her true religious affiliation, which was believed to be Protestant. This perspective is bolstered by the robust, reformed concepts that she expressed following Henry's demise, when her third publication, Lamentation of a Sinner, was released in the latter part of 1547. In 1546, the Bishop of Winchester and Lord Wriothesley attempted to alienate the monarch from her. An arrest warrant was issued, and widespread rumours circulated around England of the king's infatuation with her intimate companion, the Duchess of Suffolk. Well, of course, it doesn't take too much to believe that with Henry VIII. I don't think people would have been too surprised, if it were true. Well, nevertheless, upon seeing the warrant, she successfully restored her relationship with the king by stating that her discussions about religion were solely intended to divert his attention from the distress caused by his manky leg. Of course, he had a lot of gout and all of these problems at this time. He couldn't stop eating either. Well, you've seen the pictures, as I've said. Now, on the next day, Chancellor Wriothesley, accompanied by a detachment of his guards, attempted to apprehend her as she was having a little walk with Henry, who was, well, they were completely unaware of their reconciliation. Of course, the king was not impressed by this, and he terminated the Chancellor immediately. The time of Henry, of course, had to come to an end too. Prior to his death, however, he arranged for an annual stipend of £7,000 to be allocated to Catherine to sustain her financially. He additionally commented that following his demise, Catherine, despite becoming a queen dowager, should be accorded the same level of reverence as a reigning Queen of England. If he was still alive, that is. Well, following the crowning of her stepson, Edward VI, on 31st of January 1547, Catherine withdrew from the royal court and settled in her residence at Old Manor, Chelsea. Well, it was during this period that Catherine started experiencing conflicts with her brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, who held the title of First Duke of Somerset. Similar to Thomas, Edward Edward held the position of the king's uncle and also served as the Lord Protector. A rivalry emerged between Catherine and her previous lady-in-waiting, Anne Seymour, the Duchess of Somerset, primarily centered around Catherine's extensive collection of jewelry. The Duchess contended that Catherine, in her role as Queen Dowager, no longer had the right to adorn herself with the precious gemstones that rightfully belonged to the king's wife. Now that's fighting words, that's for sure. On the contrary, she, as the wife of the guardian, should be designated individual rights to don the garments. Well, the entire incident caused a lasting and irreparable rift in their relationship. Additionally, the relationship between the two Seymour brothers deteriorated further due to Thomas perceiving the dispute as a direct assault on his social status by his brother. Well, Catherine also released her third literary work in November of 1547. The book advocated the Protestant doctrines of justification through faith alone, which the Catholic Church considered to be heretical. The sponsorship for this event was provided by Catherine Brandon, the Duchess of Suffolk, as well as by William Parr, Catherine's brother. The preamble for the event was written by William Cecil, who would later become Elizabeth I's chief minister. Parr commenced the organization of an English translation of Erasmus's paraphrases upon the New Testament in either 1544 or 1545. Now, the huge volume of work was ultimately published in 1548. Parr recruited Nicholas Udall, Thomas Cleaves, and Mary Tudor to translate various portions, and it's possible that she herself created sections within Matthew. Well, either way, over the years, many educated members of the parish would have come across extensive expressions of admiration for Parr's knowledge, her dedication to the Bible in the common language, and her contribution to the English Reformation. In fact, she possessed a multitude of books and actively engaged in cultural traditions of annotating her own books and autographing books that were held by others. Imagine what it would be worth if you had an autographed copy of one of her books. Well, of course, there was life after Henry, and she actually conceived a child when she reached the age of 35. Now, this came as a little unexpected, as she'd not been pregnant in her previous 3 marriages. At this juncture, Thomas Seymour, her new husband, had developed a fascination for Lady Elizabeth. Well, I say new husband, but they weren't quite married yet. It is said that Seymour had allegedly planned to marry her before marrying Catherine, and it was later said that Catherine found the two of them in an intimate embrace. Now that is scandalous. According to Kat Ashley's deposition, there were a few instances where the situation was on the verge of getting quite out of control. During these times, Catherine not only agreed to participate in playful activities, but also actively helped her husband. I'm not going to go too far into that. Unfortunately, there's a few tragedies of Elizabeth's early life that I'd rather not talk about. I'm sure you can piece it together through imagination. Well, Elizabeth was sent away in May of 1548 to reside with Sir Anthony Denny's household at Cheshunt, and from then on she never had the opportunity to see her stepmother again, although they did maintain correspondence. Upon departing Chelsea, Elizabeth promptly penned a letter to both the Queen and Seymour, a letter that exhibits quite a form of regret. After Catherine's death and Seymour's detention for another attempt to marry Lady Elizabeth, Cat Ashley, who had acquired a romantic interest in Seymour while she was at Chelsea, urged the Lady Elizabeth to cooperate with him. At one juncture, she even expressed her belief that Elizabeth would have been fortunate to have a spouse of Seymour's caliber. She informed Lady Elizabeth that Seymour had disclosed his desire to marry her before Catherine. Well, following Catherine's demise, Ashley fervently urged Elizabeth to compose a letter to Seymour expressing her sympathies, aiming to console him in grief, as he would perceive great benevolence in such an act. In June 1548, Catherine relocated to Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire, escorted by Lady Jane Grey. The Dowager Queen pledged to furnish her with schooling. Catherine would spend the final months of her pregnancy and the last summer of her life in that location. She delivered her sole child, a female named Mary Seymour, in honour of Catherine's stepdaughter Mary, on the 30th of August 1548. And on the 5th of September 1548, Catherine passed away at Sudley Castle, likely due to childbed fever, a sickness that was prevalent as the result of inadequate cleanliness during childbirth procedures of the time. The funeral of Catherine took place on the 7th of September 1548. This event was the inaugural Protestant funeral conducted in the English language, and Lady Jane Grey served as the primary mourner for her. The burial took place in St. Mary's Chapel, located on the premises of Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire, England. And with that, we reach the end of the lives of Henry VIII. Well, the lives of the wives of Henry VIII. My goodness, what am I saying? It was a long video, give me a break. Now, I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, and Sally. Thank you very much for your support, and thank you for listening so far. You know I'll be back here tomorrow, same time, same place. Who knows what we'll talk about next? But you know we'll be talking about something. Good night, lots of love to you all.